All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Now, you might be wondering, why study such a highly controversial dystopian novel? Well, today we're going to impartially unpack the deep mechanics of societal anxiety laid out in Jean Raspail's The Camp of the Saints. Basically, this text serves as a visceral postmortem of the Enlightenment project, and it presents this massive, atavistic challenge to Western civilization. We're going to strictly examine the mechanics the author uses to map out the psychological and cultural atrophy of a society that's facing a massive biological surge. Let's break down the core arguments of this source material.
When man has nothing left, he looks askance at certainty. The dimmer the chance, the brighter the hope. This is a pretty striking quote straight from the source, and it perfectly sets the stage for our clinical dissection of this fictional civilizational collapse. Raspail uses this core idea to show exactly how traditional values are subverted and then actually weaponized against the very structures that birthed them in the first place.
To keep things organized, we're breaking this complex narrative down into 5 key pillars: the adoption trigger, the weaponization of pity, subversion through myths, media as a Trojan horse, and finally, the fragility of tradition. Starting with Pillar 1, the adoption trigger. Let's see how a simple policy sparked an entire exodus.
So the text kicks off with an inciting incident at the Belgian consulate in Calcutta, exploring what we can call the myth of the newfound paradise. The novel explains that this mere administrative policy of restraint actually acted like a giant beacon. By closing its gates to overseas adoptions, the West counterintuitively confirmed its own exclusivity. It inadvertently turned itself into this sacred forbidden garden that was worth absolutely any sacrifice to besiege. The very attempt to establish a boundary became the spark that ignited the whole movement.
And this created a genuinely chaotic scene of what the source calls desperate marketing right at the consulate gates. You had mothers presenting their pretty babies with plump little thighs, desperately hoping to secure a future in the land of milk and honey. But right behind them, pressing in, were the mothers of monsters. Children with severe physical deformities, like lidless eyes and stumps for limbs. The psychological vulnerability Raspail is exploring here is fascinating. These women truly believed that a paradise so incredibly well protected must be the absolute only place where their offspring could survive. So a simple policy of restraint became a beacon for an apocalypse. Moving right along to Pillar 2, the weaponization of pity and how conscience is subverted.
In this second pillar, the text posits a rather jarring idea: insufferable pity functioning as a monstrous cancer. The novel heavily explores the psychological vulnerabilities of the target society, essentially portraying Western pity as a deep, fatal form of self-contempt. This really comes to a head during a sharp confrontation where the Belgian consul accuses religious and philosophical leaders, who the book refers to as the statues, of actually welcoming their own destruction, just out of sheer shame for the flesh and heritage they were born with.
The author brilliantly illustrates this clinical divide between the two worlds using what we can call the 20 soaps metaphor. An Indian official in the text points this out. He says the West scrubs away the stink of the East with 20 soaps, while the East washes away the stink of the West with equal fervor. It's this profound boundary of mutual repulsion, but the catch is, it only dissolves when the host nation's convictions falter. Now notice how the text categorizes this collapse into a highly methodical 3-layered wave. First up is ugliness. That's the physical misery bowing to Western beauty until that beauty is just completely submerged. Second is fear, which causes the total psychological paralysis of a recipient nation that has entirely lost the will to protect its own people. And finally, famine. That's the driving, primal biological desperation that simply overrides all artificial borders and treaties. It's a very clinical breakdown of an unstoppable force, mapped out step by the author. Let's hit Pillar 3, subversion through new myths. This is where the ideological assault really begins. Think about how symbols can completely paralyze a society's defenses. The text introduces this concept of the monster totem to demonstrate how a prodigious demagogue actually weaponizes the raw sight of the deformed. The fleet is galvanized by a pariah figure, a dung roller from the Ganges, who carries his deformed son with lidless eyes right on his shoulders. This child functions as a literal, living flag. Raspail designs this specific imagery to paralyze the civilized West's conscience, rendering them physically unable to fire upon the very people they originally set out to exclude.
This dynamic creates what the source calls an apocalypse in reverse. By completely flipping the script on Western religion, the fleet's leader creates a brand new mythos. He rallies the masses with a vision of a subverted scripture where monster children will dance on the deck of a newfound paradise, while a clumsy, weeping Christian god is left entirely abandoned on the shore, crying as the fleet sails away. This new mythos is what totally disarms the host nation's traditional moral defenses.
On to Pillar 4, Media as a Trojan Horse. Let's look at the architects of this surrender.
So, the source text turns a highly critical eye toward the media class. We see two contrasting archetypes of complicity in the novel. On one side, we have Albert Durfort, the quote-unquote Sorrow of the airwaves. He commodifies moral indignation using this aggressive talk-rough style to shame the public, basically convincing them they're exploiters whose absolute only path to redemption is complete surrender. And on the flip side is Boris Vilsberg. He dismantles traditional certainties with dogmatic, relentless doubt. While Durfort shames, Vilsberg paralyzes. Reispel portrays them operating in tandem to ensure the public has succumbed to the narcotic of self-reproach long before the fleet even arrives.
Nothing pays like generosity. The text really exposes the highly cynical internal logic of this media machine. It represents a sort of Suede of life capitalism, where corporate sponsors actively profit off the rhetoric of their own civilizational downfall. They are literally busy sawing off the branch they're sitting on, completely oblivious to the fact that the new world approaching will have absolutely no use for their sophisticated betrayals.
Finally, Pillar 5, the fragility of tradition. This is where the defenses completely fail. In this final pillar, we examine how historical defenses ultimately crumble. The story of an old professor, Monsieur Calgues, serves as a really profound metaphor for the final days of high culture. We have what's called the old oak door fallacy. You see, the professor lives in a house built in 1673, protected by a massive, solid 300-year-old oak door. But this ancestral physical barrier becomes utterly meaningless, just a useless, purely symbolic defense against a world that has, in the author's own words, lived too long. A piece of wood simply cannot hold back a sheer demographic surge. And the internal rot that accompanies this external surge is perfectly personified by a local youth. He's a looter whom the text explicitly labels a white Hindu, because he has already fully adopted the mindset and aesthetics of the invader. When this looter mocks the professor, it becomes crystal clear that high culture, like Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik playing softly in the background, absolutely cannot halt the reality of biological replacement presented in the book. The professor's eventual killing of the looter is described as a victory Western style, which is to say a tidy, solitary, and ultimately absurd and useless act inside a house that is already culturally surrendered.
Bringing us to the conclusion, the river of sperm and the eye of the storm.
Let's examine the author's final, chilling, biological thesis. An Indian official in the text offers this framing, calling it the river of sperm. He argues that the West is being submerged by a triumphant biological surge of life that has simply shifted its course toward the sunset. The text posits that this isn't just a migration, it's a shifting course of history itself. The source concludes that a world that continues to multiply will always inevitably overwhelm a civilization that has retreated into the sterility of self-reproach. The central thesis here is that a civilization just cannot survive when it ceases to genuinely believe in its own cause.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, incredibly provocative question directly from the source material. The professor's final musing remains, if a door really has to be open or shut, has the modern world forgotten how to find the key? It's a gripping question about the mechanics of self-preservation that Reispel just leaves hanging in the air. What does this tell us about how modern societies view their own survival? Thank you so much for diving into this structured breakdown with me. Keep exploring, keep learning, and as always, keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.